National Assembly passes the MTEF and FSP ahead of President Buhari's submission of the 2020 budget. I'm Linda Kibi, and you're welcome to the Gavel. The Senate and House of Reps Committees on Finance concluded work on the MTEF and FSP and submitted the reports in their various chambers. Now, both houses then passed to the MTEF after a debate. The National Assembly approved that the total estimated expenditure of the federal government in the 2020 budget be increased from 10.002 trillion to 10.729 trillion naira. Now, with the MTEF passed, President Buhari is set to present the 2020 budget before a joint session of the National Assembly on 8th October. Now, this is the earliest time the president is bringing the budget in the last few years. On Thursday, September 25th, the National Assembly received the 2020 to 2022 Medium-Term Expenditure Framework MTEF and Fiscal Strategy Paper FSP from President Muhammadu Buhari.
With effect from 2020,
the report was referred to the Senate and Reps Committees on Finance for further legislative action. The Senate and House of Representatives Joint Committee on Finance held a public hearing on the MTEF. In attendance were the Minister of Finance, the Comptroller General of the Nigerian Customs Service, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, among others. Committee members expressed concern over revenue leakages in the system.
There is need for the National Assembly and indeed the Finance Committee to create means and plans to block revenue leakages in the public finance as a way of consolidating funds for needed social and infrastructural development, as well as reducing deficit in an annual federal budget.
The agencies reviewed their performances over the past years and shed more light on the content of the MTEF, as well as gave more details on the proposed increase of value-added tax VAT.
Global economic recovery is projected to slow down from 3.6% in 2018 to 3.2% in 2019. However, we expect a rebound to 3.5% for the year 2020.
All the requirements that anybody requires, both the rich and the poor, are VAT exempt. I'm quite aware that this government has put a focus on agriculture, on education, on healthcare. All those items are VAT exempt.
The Comptroller General of Customs also gave an analysis of the effects of the closure of the country's land borders.
In September, that we collected 9.2 billion in one day. It has never happened before. And this is after the closure of the border. And since then, we have maintained the average of about 4.7 to 5.8 on a daily basis. Our revenue has not reduced. As a matter of fact, it's increasing as a result of the closure of the border.
The committee thereafter invited the CBN governor to explain the 305 naira exchange rate in the 2020 budget.
to the Almighty God, I'm pleased to inform you.
The following day of October 3rd, the chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance presented the MTEF before the Senate. The 2020 to 2022 Medium-Term Expenditure Framework MTEF and Fiscal Strategy Paper FSP are expected to set out key parameters and assumptions underlying fiscal policies, as well as a revenue and expenditure profile for the 2020 federal budget. The chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance presented some of the findings in the report, which include that most of the revenue-generating agencies failed to comply with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which stipulates payment of 80% of operational surpluses to the consolidated revenue account. The salaries and remuneration for the proposed recruitment of 30,000 personnel in the police, army, immigration and civil defense were not captured in the MTEF and FSP. The activities of the NNPC as it relates to cost of production is shrouded in secrecy.
The committee frowned at the attitude of Central Bank of Nigeria for under-disclosure of the e-collection of stamp duties.
The committee recommended, among others, that $57 per barrel as crude oil benchmark price, an exchange rate of 305 naira to a dollar for economic stability, and total estimated expenditure of the federal government be increased from 10.002 trillion to 10.729.4 trillion naira.
The revenue target of Nigerian Customs Service of 942.6 billion for 2020 should be increased to 1.5 trillion as a result of the performance of the Nigerian Customs Services in the last 9 months. With 3 months still outstanding, the Nigerian Customs Service revenue as at September stood at 1 trillion naira against the budgeted figure of 969 billion naira for the year 2019.
The debate on the MTEF was then thrown open.
The CBN governor is only just providing only 200 billion from stamp duty. In a country, we believe that we can realize minimum of 2.5 trillion revenue from that single source.
I'm actually quite surprised that in this entire document, nothing is said about fuel subsidy. Fuel subsidy has constituted a major expenditure in this nation.
If we put our security system properly and then have a better way of managing to know our production, this country in 2020 can produce more than maybe 3 to 4 million barrels per day. Because I am informed from my research that we lose close to 100,000 barrels every day.
If you look at the numbers here, you will discover that over 50% of all our revenue still comes from oil. And the foreign exchange is about almost even 90% of all that foreign exchange that we generate. So clearly it tells us that something is wrong with our economy. But I'm happy. The enabler, if you look at whatever indices, researches, empirical, you will discover that the enabler of any development is infrastructures.
If we keep doing the same old things, the same old ways.
A senator made an eye-raising observation.
Our constitution provides that we have 3 senators. What is the 3 senators per state doing that 1 senator per state cannot do? Hold it. Now, what are we doing in the National Assembly there that we have 360-something people? And each of these persons creates demand on the system. We must cut down on the cost of governance.
If you want a state to have only a senator, it requires a constitutional amendment. So you have the opportunity to present a bill to seek for the amendment of the relevant section of the Constitution that provides for 3 senators per state. But I think my personal opinion is the National Assembly, the legislators here, both Senate and the House, are tasked to think deep, to think wide on how we can generate more revenues, on how the revenues we generate, no matter how big or small, are prudently, efficiently, and economically applied. And that requires total, comprehensive, and holistic oversight on the executive arm of government.
The same recommendations were passed in the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, President Buhari is to present the 2020 budget to a joint session of the Senate and House of Representatives on Tuesday, October 8th. The Senate President and House of Rep Speaker have promised that the budget will be passed by the end of 2019. The Senate is set to investigate reasons for the failure to review the Production Sharing Contract Act. Now, according to the upper chamber, the failure to review this act has so far cost Nigeria 7 trillion naira over 20 years and will cost us more if the matter is not handled urgently. It's the first legislative session for the week, and the attention of the Senate is on the country's oil industry.
Observe that no review of the act.
Senator Ifeanyi Ubah, who also happens to be a player in the petroleum sector, moves a motion calling the attention of the Senate to the huge losses amounting to 7 trillion naira, which Nigeria has suffered because of the failure of Parliament and the federal government to review the Production Sharing Contract Act. The production sharing contract is a contractual arrangement for petroleum exploration and production, whereby the state, as owner of petroleum resources, engages a contractor to provide technical and financial services for exploration and production operations for an agreed share in profit after payment of royalty, cost and tax oil. Section 16 of the PSC Act stipulates that where the price of crude oil exceeds $20 per barrel, the Act will be reviewed to ensure that the share of the federal government in the additional revenue is adjusted to the extent that the PSCs shall be economically beneficial to the federal government.
Senate knows that Nigeria, having lost trillions of naira due to non-review of the PSC Act, stands to gain an additional sum of 30 billion monthly, 360 billion annually, if the Act is reviewed and amended, which would boost our revenue base significantly.
According to senators, besides costing the country trillions of naira, the failure to review the Act every 15 years, as stipulated in the legislation, has cost Nigeria to also lose 350 billion naira to fund the 2019 budget.
In this year, Mr. President, they have put 160 billion. If this Act is not amended for us to assess this money, it means that the budget deficit that we are going to get in 2020 will be beyond the 3% threshold as provided by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And so it is very important for us to pass this motion so that we will be able to assess the 160 billion.
In this particular case, you will find that last year, or this year, 2019, they expected to get 320 billion. They didn't get almost nothing. And that's what accounted for a lot of the deficit in the budget of 2019, which has to be cut by more than 40%. This year, or in 2020, they are proposing to get about 160 billion. Now, if we don't initiate any attempt to review this particular thing, even the 160 billion that we have put in that particular budget of 2020, we are going to get nothing. So, Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, I think this issue is not an issue of sentiments or any matter. It's for us to rise up to the occasion and save this country by getting the relevant revenue and by doing the work that we are supposed to do.
The individual oil fields, are they making profit? You make reference to the $20 per barrel, that the price has gone above $20 per barrel and there is a need to review the Act. But are the individual oil fields making profit after making provision for relevant costs? I think we need to identify that. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to discuss further with the relevant authorities, because the accrued revenue that we are talking about may not be there. They may just be paper profit. They may just be paper revenue that we are accruing and hoping that it is there. So I think we need to discuss further with the relevant authorities to know exactly what the situation is.
The amendment we need to do must be at a jet speed to make sure that the Act specifically states, among other things, for Nigerians to take their own share of the production sharing contract. Mr. President, don't forget that the joint venture agreement that we have with all these oil companies, they took us to court and they said the cost they incur, they want to recover it within the next 5 years. Every day, 160,000 barrels of our oil are used to pay all these costs incurred by these IOCs under the production sharing contract. In 2020 Appropriation Act alone, we are paying 992 billion naira, which are deduction already provided for in the document before us, which we are paying to all these oil companies. And we have been paying this money since about 2016. Sir, if they are collecting their own cost incurred under the JV arrangement, this production sharing contract clearly states that anything above $20, which ordinarily accrue to us, and the law that we currently have said, they might come to the table if they so wish.
In the meantime, the bill for the amendment of the PSC Act is expected to be before the Senate on Thursday, October 3rd, and Senate President Ahmed Lawan promises that it will be given prompt passage.